Some debts can't be measured in currency. Kellen Whitmore learned that truth the morning he found a woman bleeding into the dust near his property line. She was tall, taller than most men he'd known, with dark hair matted with blood and clothes torn from violence he didn't want to imagine. When she opened her eyes and looked at him, there was no plea for help in that gaze, only warning. Within hours, armed riders would arrive at his door, and the choice he made in that moment would either save him or destroy the last thing he had left. The letter had arrived 3 days earlier. Kellen didn't need to open it to know what it said. The same thing the previous 4 had said. 45 days to settle his accounts or lose the ranch. The land his father had broken his back to claim. The soil Ken had watered with his own sweat for 20 years would belong to someone else. He'd stood in his empty kitchen that morning, the paper trembling in his callous hands, and felt something inside him go hollow. Now he was checking the irrigation channels that fed his withering crops, trying to calculate if he could squeeze one more season from land that seemed determined to betray him. The sun hadn't fully risen, but the heat was already pressing down like a physical weight. His boots kicked up dust with each step, the dry earth cracking beneath him like broken promises. That's when he saw her. She was collapsed against a rock formation, one arm wrapped around her ribs, the other hanging useless at her side. Blood had soaked through the leather of her clothing, dark and still spreading. Kellen froze, his first instinct screaming at him to turn around, to pretend he'd seen nothing. Getting involved with tribal matters was asking for trouble he couldn't afford. The territories were a careful balance of invisible boundaries and unspoken agreements, and crossing those lines usually meant violence. But she was dying. He could see it in the way her chest rose and fell in shallow, desperate pulse. Kellen moved forward before his mind could overrule his legs. As he approached, her eyes snapped open, dark, fierce, aware. She tried to push herself up, failed, and her hand moved to something at her belt. A blade. Even wounded and weak, she was ready to fight. Easy, he said quietly, raising both hands. I'm not here to hurt you. She studied him with an intensity that made him feel exposed, like she was reading every thought behind his eyes. Then her gaze shifted past him, scanning the horizon. And something like fear crossed her face. Not fear of him, fear of what was coming. They're looking for you, Kellen said. It wasn't a question. She nodded once, then her eyes rolled back and she slumped against the rock, unconscious, maybe dying. Kellen looked back toward his ranch house, barely visible in the distance. Then at the woman, then at the empty landscape around them. No one had seen him yet. He could walk away, let nature or whoever was hunting her finish what they'd started. Save himself the inevitable trouble. His hands were already moving, sliding under her shoulders, testing her weight. She was heavy with muscle and height, and getting her back to his place would mean every second counted. The wound in her side was deep, and the amount of blood she'd already lost meant she might not survive the trip. But leaving her wasn't an option his conscience would allow. He lifted her with a grunt. Her dead weight pressing against his chest, and started the long walk back. Every step felt like a choice he couldn't take back. Every minute that passed was another minute closer to whoever was tracking her finding them both. By the time he reached his barn, his shirt was soaked with her blood and his own sweat. He kicked open the door and carried her into the darkness, laying her on a bed of hay in the back corner. Only then did he see the markings on her clothing, intricate beadwork, patterns he'd seen before on the few tribal members who came to trade in the distant settlement. This wasn't just any woman, and he'd just made himself part of whatever storm was following her. The wound was worse than Kellen had thought. He'd seen injuries before. Ranch work provided plenty of opportunities for blood, but this was different. The gash across her ribs was deep, deliberate, the kind of damage that came from someone trying to kill, not wound. He worked quickly in the dim light of the barn, tearing strips from an old shirt to make bandages. His hands steady despite the situation spiraling beyond his control. She woke while he was cleaning the wound, her entire body going rigid. Her hand shot out and gripped his wrist with surprising strength. Her eyes wild and unfocused. For a moment, Kain thought she might break his arm. "You need to stay still," he said, his voice low but firm. "That wound keeps bleeding. You won't last another hour." She stared at him, breath coming in short gasps, clearly trying to decide if he was a threat or an ally. Then her gaze dropped to the water basin beside him, to the clean cloth in his hand, to the bandages he'd prepared. Slowly, her grip loosened. "Why?" Her voice was rough, barely more than a whisper. Callan didn't have an answer that made sense, even to himself, because leaving you to die didn't seem right. She studied him for a long moment, then leaned back against the hay, allowing him to continue. Her jaw was clenched tight, but she didn't make a sound as he pressed the cloth against the wound. Most men he knew would have been screaming. "They'll come looking," she said after a while. "Soon." "Who?" "Everyone." She closed her eyes. "My people. The ones who did this. Maybe others." Ken tied off the bandage, his mind racing through implications he didn't want to face. What happened? An ambush. 3 men, maybe 4. I was hunting alone, tracking elk beyond our usual territory. They were waiting. She touched the bandage carefully, testing it. They knew I'd be there. Someone from your own people? Her eyes opened, sharp and alert despite the pain. I didn't say that, but she didn't need to. The silence that followed told Callan everything. This wasn't just tribal politics he'd stumbled into. This was betrayal. The kind that got people killed in ways that couldn't be taken back. He stood and moved to the barn door. Peering through the gap, the sun was higher now, burning off the morning haze. In the distance, beyond his withering fields, he could see dust rising against the horizon. Riders still far enough away that he couldn't count them, but close enough to be inevitable. They're coming, he said quietly. Behind him, he heard her trying to stand, heard her sharp intake of breath as the movement pulled at her wound. When he turned, she was on her feet. One hand pressed against the barn wall for support, the other reaching for something that wasn't there, looking for a weapon she'd lost. You can't fight, Ka'in Sa'id. You can barely stand. Then I'll die standing. There was no bravado in her voice. Just simple fact. But I won't let them find me hiding in your barn. That would make you a target, too. Callan looked at her, this tall, wounded woman who'd rather face down her killers than put him at risk, and felt something shift in his chest. He'd spent months watching his land die, watching his future crumble, feeling helpless against forces he couldn't control. But this was different. This was a choice he could make. He walked to the corner of the barn and pulled back a tarp, revealing the rifle he kept for predators. Not much, but it was loaded and he knew how to use it. You're going to stay hidden, he said, checking the chamber. And I'm going to deal with whoever comes riding up to my property uninvited. You don't understand what you're risking. Maybe not, he turned to face her, but it's my risk to take. The dust cloud was closer now, minutes away, maybe less. And Ken Whitmore, a man who couldn't save his own ranch, was about to put his life on the line for a stranger whose name he didn't even know. 3 riders emerged from the dust cloud, their horses dark with sweat. They wore a mix of tribal clothing and items clearly taken from settlers, a combination that made Callan's stomach tighten. These weren't hunters or scouts. These were men who existed in the spaces between 2 worlds, belonging to neither, which made them more dangerous than either. Callan stepped out of the barn before they could dismount. The rifle held casually but visibly across his chest, not pointing at anyone but impossible to ignore. The lead rider, a man with a scar running from his temple to his jaw, pulled his horse to a stop 15 fuß away. Morning, Ka'in Sa'id, his voice level. The scarred man didn't return the greeting. His eyes moved past Callan to the barn, then to the house, then back to Callan's face. We're tracking someone. A woman, tall, dark hair, wounded. You seen anyone like that? Just me in the dirt out here, Khan Said. What's she done? That's not your concern. The man's hand rested on the knife at his belt. You mind if we look around? I do, actually. This is private property. The second rider, younger and twitchy, looked. Private property? You hear that? Man thinks lines on paper mean something out here. Khan kept his attention on the leader. They mean something to me, and they should mean something to anyone with respect for another man's land. The Scotsman studied him, clearly trying to decide if Kalen was brave or stupid. You're in a bad spot to be making stands, friend. That's a lot of dead crop behind you. Place looks like it's one bad season from being dust. That's my business. And the woman we're tracking is ours. The man leaned forward in his saddle. His last chance. You seen her or not? Ken's grip tightened on the rifle. Every instinct screamed at him to just tell them no and let them move on. But something in the way they carried themselves, the way they'd phrased the question, told him they already suspected. They were testing him, waiting to see if he'd lie. I told you there's no one here but me. The scarred man's eyes narrowed. Then he made a gesture, and the other two riders began to spread out, flanking toward the barn from both sides. Kalen raised the rifle, not quite pointing it, but making his intention clear. That's far enough. You really want to die for someone you don't even know? The leader asked. I want you off my land. For a moment, nobody moved. The sun beat down on them and Ken could feel sweat running down his back under his shirt. 3 against 1, and they all carried weapons. If this turned into a fight, his chances weren't good. But backing down now meant they'd tear his barn apart, find her, and probably kill them both. Then a voice called out from behind the riders, strong and clear, despite the pain it must have caused. You're looking for me. Kalin's heart stopped. She was standing in the barn doorway, one hand pressed against the frame for support, the other hanging at her side. Even wounded and swaying, there was something commanding about her presence. The 3 riders turned their horses, and Kalen saw recognition flash across their faces, followed quickly by something else. Fear. Ayana, the scarred man said. And there was weight in how he spoke her name. You should have stayed down and you should have finished what you started. She took a step forward and Kalen saw blood seeping through the bandage at her side. But you always were weak. Takakota, even when we were children, the man called Takakota's face hardened. You don't know what you've cost us. I know exactly what I cost you. Your chance to betray everything our people stand for. Kalen glanced between them, understanding dawning. This wasn't about a random attack. This was about something deeper. Something that had been building for a long time, and he just stepped into the middle of it. Takakota's hand moved to his knife. The farmer protected you. That makes him part of this now. Ayana's eyes met Ken's for a brief moment, and he saw something there he hadn't seen before. Regret. She tried to warn him, tried to leave, and he'd refused to listen. Now they'd both pay the price. The moment stretched thin as wire. Takakota's hand was on his knife. The other 2 riders had their hands moving toward their weapons. And Kalen's rifle was suddenly feeling inadequate against 3 men who looked like they'd killed before and wouldn't hesitate to do it again. Then Ayana spoke, her voice cutting through the tension like broken glass. Tell them, Takakota. Tell them what you promised the settlement men. Tell them how you planned to sell our hunting grounds for gold and whiskey. Takakota's face went dark. You don't know what you're talking about. I know you met with them 3 times. I know you drew maps showing where our camps move with the seasons. I know you told them when our warriors would be north chasing buffalo. She took another step forward and Ken could see the effort it cost her. And I know my father would have you stripped of your name for what you've done. The younger rider looked at Takakota, confusion clear on his face. Is that true? She's lying to save herself, Takakota Said. But his voice had lost its certainty. My father is Utaktai Ayana Said. And the name landed like a stone in still water. Chief of our people for 20 winters. And when he finds out what you've done, Takakota, there won't be enough distance in this territory for you to run. Cole felt his stomach drop. Chief's daughter, he'd save the chief's daughter. The implications of that crashed over him like a wave. If these men killed her, it would mean war. If they killed him, too. Nobody would ever know what really happened. But if she survived, Takakota seemed to be doing the same calculation, and Kalen could see the moment he made his decision. The knife came out smoothly, and the other 2 riders drew their weapons in response. 3 armed men against a wounded woman and a farmer with 1 rifle. Your father isn't here, Takakota Said. And that women don't tell stories. He kicked his horse forward, and everything happened at once. Ken raised the rifle and fired. The shot went wide. He'd been aiming for center mass, but the horse's sudden movement threw off his aim. The bullet caught the animal's shoulder instead, and it screamed and reared, throwing Takakota from the saddle. The other 2 riders charged, and Ken knew he didn't have time to reload. Ayana moved faster than someone with her injury should have been able to. She grabbed a pitchfork leaning against the barn wall and swung it in a wide arc that caught the second rider across the chest, knocking him sideways. He hit the ground hard, the impact driving the air from his lungs. The third rider made it to Kalen, knife already swinging down. Kalen dropped the rifle and caught the man's wrist with both hands, feeling the blade stop inches from his throat. They struggled, locked together, the rider's horse dancing nervously beneath them. Kalen could smell leather and sweat and the copper tang of blood. Whether his or someone else's, he didn't know. Then the rider jerked and went limp, sliding from his saddle. Behind him, Ayana stood with the pitchfork, its tines red, her face was pale, and the bandage at her side was completely soaked through with fresh blood. Takakota was on his feet, limping, but alive, his injured horse running off toward the horizon. He looked at his 2 companions, one groaning on the ground, the other not moving, and then at Ayana and Kalen standing together. Whatever he saw in that moment made him choose survival over vengeance. He ran. Kalen watched him disappear into the brush, knowing they'd just made an enemy who wouldn't stop. But before he could process that thought, Ayana's knees buckled. He caught her before she hit the ground. And this time, when he felt the warmth of her blood against his hands, he knew she'd torn something vital. Your father, he said urgently. How do I find him? You don't, she whispered. He finds you. Then she was unconscious again and Ken was alone with 2 bodies in his yard, a wounded woman in his arms, and the certainty that everything was about to get much worse before it got better. They arrived at dawn. Ken had spent the night keeping Ayana alive, changing bandages with torn bed sheets, forcing water between her lips when she was conscious enough to swallow. He dragged the body of the dead rider into the barn and tied up the wounded one, who'd regained consciousness and immediately started threatening everything from slow death to complete destruction of Kalen's land. Kalen had gagged him with a strip of cloth and tried not to think about what he'd done, what line he'd crossed that couldn't be uncrossed. When he heard the horses, he knew immediately these weren't more of Takakota's people. There were too many of them, and they moved with a discipline that spoke of real warriors, not traitors and thieves. He counted 15 riders as they crested the hill, all armed, all moving in formation toward his ranch. Kalen stepped out onto his porch, unarmed this time. Fighting wasn't an option anymore. Whatever happened next was beyond his control. The riders stopped 50 Fuß from his house. The man at their center sat his horse like he'd been born in the saddle. And even from that distance, Kalen could see the authority in how he held himself. He wore a